If I chose a term to describe my biblical approach, it would be the term zero sum. Essentially, I ignore virtually all scholarship on the Bible in favor of trying to determine the evidence myself. The reason behind this approach is quite simple. There are far too many assumptions in Bible scholarship, so many assumptions that it complicates a typical outside-in approach. To illustrate my approach, I'll contrast it to the consensus approach. Imagine, if you will, the Bible as a monolith. It's one big impenetrable rock. Up until around 200 years ago, this was the biblical consensus. The Bible was mostly unquestioned. Now, before this time, theologians were not completely oblivious to the problem with the text. They recognized that there were indeed some inconsistencies, but they already had a philosophy that could be used to fix the problem. It was called apologetics. Apologetics was a very old philosophy. It was one of the first philosophies of Christianity. Essentially, the idea was to make an argument which would make two inconsistent things consistent. A modern example of apologetics would be an argument that would put dinosaurs in the Garden of Eden. It's not a great argument, but it attempts to make the Bible consistent with science. That's exactly what the apologetic argument does. Now, that is one of the more obvious examples, but the state of modern biblical scholarship is far worse than even that. It's in terrible condition. What happened in the last 200 years is that critical scholarship began to be applied to the Bible monolith. And what critical scholars found was that the Bible was full of holes, so many holes that the Bible monolith began to look like Swiss cheese. As a result of this critical scholarship, theological scholars, who to this day represent a vast majority of biblical scholars, went back to their infinite well of apologetics. They couldn't really fix the holes. All they could do was patch them. They had to make the inconsistencies appear consistent, and apologetics was exactly the right tool for this. Today, this is the state of Bible scholarship. Critical scholars rip holes in the old Bible monolith, and theological scholars repair the damage with apologetics. It could even be said that the vast majority of the old monolith is now pure apologetics. Critical scholarship has made great progress in determining the exact nature of the Bible, but the potential for apologetics is virtually infinite. No matter what critical scholarship says, apologetics will always be there to attempt to fill the gaps. If I took an outside-in approach, what essentially I would be doing is accepting a premise determined by others. Critical scholarship is fantastic, but it hasn't managed to topple the monolith, and apologetic arguments have found their way into critical scholarship. Take the book of Revelation, for example. The theological approach says it's prophecy written in 96 CE. The critical approach says it's fiction, probably written in 96 CE. This is the battle line between the two factions. The 96 CE date is simple cross-pollination. There is no support for the date. So why do critical scholars grant this date? It seems counterintuitive, but that's the problem. Even critical scholarship has accepted some of the theological argument. And it's the same with the Pauline letters. Even most critical scholarship grants the theological dates. But why? Again, there is no evidence. What is happening here? What you find in critical scholarship is that it has been corrupted by its contact with theological scholarship. Even though critical scholars spend their time poking holes in the Bible, they still accept some of the apologetic arguments. This is why I take the zero-sum approach. I can't trust that any version of modern scholarship is based on a stable premise. If critical scholars are willing to accept dates without question, then I don't see any reason to bother reading critical scholars. It's bad methodology all around. There are advantages and disadvantages to taking the zero-sum approach. The greatest advantage is that whatever evidence is located is simply the evidence. The evidence isn't argued, it just is what it is. The evidence determines the reality. Apologetics and critiques of apologetics are not even applicable to this approach. Evidence is simply evidence. It does not argue anything. The biggest disadvantage to taking the zero-sum approach is that evidence has to be collected. What this means is that the initial understanding may be far removed from the final understanding. A requirement of this approach is that whatever the evidence is, that evidence is important. Whatever the answer is, it is simply the answer. For example, say I made a video dating the book of Matthew, and 2 months later I made a book dating the book of Hebrews. If Hebrews gives evidence for the dating of Matthew, then my understanding of Matthew must change. That means my initial video is deficient. That's unfortunate, but that's how zero-sum works. I cannot assume that I know anything going in. If I approach a book of the Bible, I can only take previously determined evidence with me. That's all. I can't assume that I know what the book is about. And this is where you guys come in. You guys keep asking questions, and if I can't answer it, I have to figure out what the answer is. Every time I locate something, more questions are raised. You guys have given me questions that I had not thought of, and that works very well with my approach. I may not be able to sufficiently answer the questions now, but I certainly would hope that with more evidence, I could find a sufficient answer. Zero-sum is exploration in a pure sense. It doesn't address modern arguments. Instead, it's simply an attempt to locate evidence. And if the evidence can be located, then we get a much clearer picture of the Christian texts and Christianity.